Hello and welcome to the 20 Questions podcast with Tyler Rakin. I'm your host, Tyler Rakin, and I've got another great episode for you today. This week, I talked with someone that actually went to the same exact school that I'm going to right now, Syracuse University. And this play-by-play broadcaster got his start at SU, worked his way up through minor league baseball, college wrestling, and now works for ESPN doing a collection of great sports at the highest levels for the biggest name in the sports broadcasting industry. It's going to be a great episode to listen to, so get ready for 20 Questions with Mike Couzens. Hey, Mike, it's great to have you on the show. How are you doing today?
I'm good. It's really good to be with you.
Thank you very much. So for those of you listening, you might not realize how busy Mike is. We are very, very lucky to have him squeeze us into our schedule. And let's learn about your schedule a little bit at first. Mike, what sports do you broadcast right now? When do you broadcast them? And what does the Mike Couzens calendar look like nowadays?
So I usually talk about my calendar as it relates to kind of the academic calendar because I'm doing mostly college sports. So I always say to people, if you need me on a weekend between Labor Day and Memorial Day, it's probably dicey because I'm usually going to be doing a game somewhere. So starting with college football, I'll do a game every week, sometimes two games. When we get into the latter portion of the schedule and you get the midweek MAC games in there as well. Then I go into college basketball. So that's from November all the way through March. And then in the spring, I shouldn't skip over. I've got wrestling as well in the winter as well. So I've done 5 NCAA championships for wrestling. And then in the spring, I get into college softball. I do a lot of that. And then as the postseason comes around, I'll do some college baseball as well. So I did a regional this year. And then this year I've done a handful of MLB games on ESPN radio. So this past weekend, I was in San Francisco on Saturday and Anaheim on Sunday to do games. So in the summertime, it slows down a little bit, but stay pretty busy throughout the rest of the year.
Yeah, sounds like you got a lot going on and a lot of good stuff that we'll probably talk about later. But first, I kind of want to go back to the start for you, because that answer is different for everyone. How did you fall in love with broadcasting? When did you know that's what you want to do?
I guess there's two different answers to that question, in that when I really started to enjoy broadcasting was at a very young age, and I would say elementary school, because I did not have cable TV growing up. And so the primary way for me to get, constant entertainment was through baseball on the radio. And so I grew up listening to Mets games on the radio. And fortunately, it's a long season, so it can take you through from, spring training in February all the way into playoff baseball in October. And of course, when you're a kid out of school in the summer, you're just looking for ways to kind of pass time sometimes. So that was, I really fell in love with the magic of radio. And, one day the team's at Shea Stadium, the next day they're out in Milwaukee, and then they're out in Seattle. So it was just really cool for me to hear about all those different places. Those were the players who I looked up to at that age, because you still harbor the dream of being able to be in their shoes one day. And obviously for 99.9% of us, it doesn't work out that way. And so I would say halfway through my high school career, I decided that I wanted to broadcast in college. At first, I thought I might want to go and be a lawyer, because I was involved with this YMCA model government program that I really loved. And I did it all 4 years of high school. And then when I got to college at Syracuse, actually started a club at the local Y there so that kids could do that. It was fun. But ultimately, it was, the thrill of being at a live sporting event. And especially when you're broadcasting and you've got one of the best seats in the house, there was just a pull with that for me. And so that was why I chose my college path that I did.
And did you have any idols that you looked up to at the start? Like, who were the broadcasters that you listened to and was like, I want to be just like them?
The ones who I listened to were the Mets broadcasters. So before SNY came around, I want to say in maybe 2006 or 2007, the Mets team on the radio was Bob Murphy when I was really young, and then Howie Rose, who's still phenomenal on the Mets radio broadcast, and Gary Cohen as well. And Gary is now the lead Mets broadcaster on SNY on TV. And so those were the three guys who, to me, I think, I was very lucky listening to them as a kid that they're so good. But now as somebody who I'm more critical of broadcasts because it's just what I do, they're still at the top of my list of people who are just so good at what they do. On radio, to be able to, if you're not listening all the time, hear the way that they describe a ball coming off the bat, and in your mind or your gut, it tells you based on the way that they're calling it, this has a chance to be a home run. And it's just, they make it really exciting. And Howie Rose and Gary Cohen are both two lifelong Mets fans. So they have a love and an understanding and appreciation for the franchise's history, and they know the game inside and out. And I think they're at the top of the game in what they do.
Yeah, I definitely. And then you were talking about high school. Halfway through, you started to realize you wanted to broadcast. If I did my research correctly, you were on some pretty good White Plains basketball teams back in high school. Is it true that you're 6'6"? Is that true?
I was listed at 6'6". That was the roster bump that I got. I'm actually
Okay.
only 6'4".
Okay.
But yeah, I was on a couple of very good teams. I played freshman, JV, and then 2 years of varsity. I say played. I was on the team. I sparingly played on those varsity seasons because the best player that I played with, his name's John Kilpatrick. He ended up playing for a little bit of time in the NBA.
Oh, wow.
And he may be playing overseas now, but he started out with a couple of 10-day contracts with the T-Wolves maybe 3 or 4 years ago. He played at the University of Cincinnati, and a bunch of other guys who went on to play at Division I programs. So I was on a really good team. I'm not sure how I made the team because the skill level disparity was quite big, but it was a great experience. And I still credit that, my coach there, Spencer Mayfield, for teaching me an intricate understanding of the game, which is still paying dividends now 15 years after I graduated high school because of the way that it helped me to understand the game.
Wow. Yeah. So you start understanding the game there, then you move on to Syracuse. And I know Syracuse can be a pretty intimidating place. Like you have all the names, Bob Costas, Mike Tirico, Sean McDonough. And then there's kind of like the competition when you get there, especially at Newhouse. It's such a competitive school. Were you intimidated at all going to Syracuse with what it seems like no real broadcasting experience at the time?
You're right. I didn't have any. I had zero. The only thing I had done was write for my high school newspaper. I would go and cover the girls basketball team because I was friends with the players and the head coach worked at the school. And so it was very easy reporting. It wasn't like I had to knock down any doors to try and get any interviews. Going to Syracuse, I think the biggest appeal of being so there are two student radio stations on campus. There's WAER, which does the men's basketball, football, and lacrosse, and WJPZ, known as Z89, that does high school football, the women's basketball, and the women's lacrosse. And I don't know that I ever really felt intimidated by the structure of it all. I felt like it was an environment that allowed me to thrive because I enjoy healthy competition. And within that competition, nobody is trying to get a job. Are we trying to get good assignments? Yes, but it's not our livelihoods on the line. Because at the end of the day, we're the ones who are hanging out after we're off the air all together. We live together. We're all really good friends. And I enjoyed that healthy competition because what we did every Sunday night was we would sit in the basement of WAER and we would all critique our broadcasts from the week before. So it was everybody working to get better against and also with each other. And I really enjoyed that aspect of it because it was like friendly competition. And I'm still really good friends with a lot of the guys that were at WAER and at Z89 with me throughout those years. One of them was in my wedding. And so I just love that aspect of it, where we all came in, we were all really bad together, and we all got to be a lot better together over the course of 4 years.
So the critiquing is certainly one thing that helps you get better, but you're doing play-by-play for two radio stations. How did you first learn? What was like kind of the first thing you did to kind of learn how to master the art of play-by-play? Because critiquing certainly helps, but you got to have something to critique.
I remember my first memory of trying to, we call it making a tape, when you just go sit in the stadium and do it into a recorder, was a friend of mine, Andrew Allegretta, who is now the play-by-play announcer at Vanderbilt. And he's a year older than me. So he asked me if I wanted to go to a women's basketball game and make a tape. And I really didn't know where to start. I didn't know how to prepare. I didn't know what that looked like. So I got the Post Standard newspaper and I cut out the stats that were in the paper that day, and I cut out their preview and I just kind of like taped that into a notebook and brought it with me and went from there. But I didn't really know how to do anything. And just by being around and learning how the older people did it, you would understand how you make a chart for preparation and what are the things that you want to know to put on that chart, whether it's biographical information, height, weight, hometown. Do you order it numerically? I don't. I put my basketball chart together with the highest scorer at top, and then I go down from there because I figure I'm going to be talking about that person the most, so they might as well be at the top of the piece of paper. And that's the fun part about it, is that nobody prepares the same way as anybody else. And the only person it has to work for is you. So there would be chart templates that would get passed around at the radio station of, hey, here's how I did this, or here's how I did this. And eventually you get your own rhythm and find what works for you. And for a long time, I would do mine by hand. I was doing fewer games then, so it was a little bit more feasible. And then when I started to do more games, started to digitize that, and it makes your process a little bit faster in terms of data entry, but it doesn't take away from the amount of background research that you're looking to do. So it's kind of just like you're walking on a path and you're foraging for things along the way, and you pick up what's useful and you leave what you don't think is going to be helpful, and everybody's path is different.
Yeah, and so you're talking about data entry and research, and you were the play-by-play. You did play-by-play for 2 radio stations. You ended up being the general manager of WJPZ. You did baseball broadcasting on the side. You stay involved with the YMCA. How did you juggle all of that at first? Because that's a lot of time management that you really need to learn to handle all of that.
I was very fortunate coming out of high school that I graduated with enough credits from advanced placement courses that I came into Syracuse academically as a sophomore. So I was able to, if I wanted to, I could have graduated in 3 years. I graduated in 3.5. So technically I'm in the class of 2010, even though I consider myself 2011. And so I just took 12 credits a semester because I was able to kind of drag out the process a little bit. And so I didn't have to overload myself with things. The other fortunate side of the Newhouse course, the curriculum, is that it's not like when you're studying broadcast journalism, you're going to go home and write a treatise on the history of broadcast news. A lot of it is practical application. And so there are certainly courses every semester that you're required to take that are long, maybe 3 or 4 hour courses where you might be going out and reporting or putting together a newscast. And so that's really the practical stuff. So I was fortunate also in that outside of a few electives, it's not like I was sitting down and writing really long papers or anything or doing a lot of research, because a lot of the stuff that you do was just in the classroom.
Yeah. And then before we get to your post-college career, because obviously there's a lot more to dive into there, I want to talk about, do you have any advice that you would give to current college students based off of all your great experience? If someone's in college looking to go into broadcasting, what would you suggest to them to really improve and obviously get to where someplace like you are today?
First, I would say to say yes to every opportunity that you can, whether it's a web stream of a girls' high school basketball game or whether you're doing a Division I football game. You need all the experience you can get very early on. And that'll help you out in the future because you don't know where your first gigs are going to come from. The first things that I did with ESPN were high school basketball games. Before I was full-time with ESPN, I freelanced at the Big Ten Network, and the first thing that I did for them was volleyball. So, and I had done 1 or 2 volleyball matches when I was a student at Syracuse, but when BTN asked, hey, do you do volleyball? I said, sure, I've done volleyball, absolutely. And it wasn't a lie. And so you just take every opportunity you can get, especially now where, I had never done softball before I got to ESPN. I had never watched a wrestling match before I got assigned to do that. So you never know what opportunity is going to open even more doors for you. And it's going to expose you to new things. It's great to learn as many sports as you can, and then to critique yourself, but also to have other people critique you. One of the great things about being a college student today versus when I was in school from 2007 to 2010, Twitter existed maybe in the latter half of my college career, but it wasn't as big as it is now, where if you want to reach out to somebody in the same way that you reached out to me with a direct message on Twitter, you can find anybody you want to find. Back then we were scouring for, hey, this email, we don't know if it works, but let's try and reach out to this person and see if we can hear back from them. And so it's just so much easier to reach people now. And so I think it's a great way to send your work out to people whose work you admire as a college student. One of the greatest pieces of advice that I got was in my first summer of professional baseball broadcasting was every month to reach out with a half inning of my work to 3 people whose work I admired, but I had never spoken to before. So I was getting to know more broadcasters in the business, and I was also getting really varied feedback, which is great because in the same way that everybody's preparation is different, everybody's broadcast style is different too. So while I got a lot of advice, it's not that I applied all of it because I didn't think some of it worked for me, but I think a lot of it did. And it really helped me with my storytelling, my pacing, my inflection. And those are all things that you want to be able to develop when you're in college. Also, keeping in mind, I think a really important thing is to understand your voice and how to best use your voice, because I was under this impression for the longest time, far longer than I would have liked, that I needed to sound a certain way, that I needed to have this deep, rich, booming voice, which I just wasn't born with that. And that's okay, because if you listen to broadcasters at the highest level, Joe Buck sounds different than Dan Shulman, who sounds different than Bob Costas, who sounds different from Mike Breen. Everybody has a different style, and that's okay. And that's what is fun, because we're all unique. And I think I tried to put on a voice, a deeper voice, because I thought it was better. And that's terrible physiologically. Like, the vocal cord is a muscle. The more strain you put on that, the same way as a bicep or a hamstring, the more it's going to falter under pressure when you really need it. So understanding how to breathe and how to get enough sleep and drink enough water and take care of your voice is also really important.
Yeah, and I do want to pick your brain a little bit more when you were talking about Twitter and feedback, because you really prioritize that. I mean, if you look at Mike's Twitter, you literally have a pinned tweet that's saying, if you're a college broadcaster, you want feedback on your reel, please feel free to reach out to me. I mean, that you probably get a lot of people responding to you. That takes a lot of time to go through all that on top of what your job is. So why do you make that such a priority? Why do you work so hard to make sure that you're helping the guys coming after you?
I think it stems from the fact that I had a lot of disappointing experiences reaching out to people who were ahead of me when I started doing that, whether it was not hearing back at all, or whether it was somebody writing back after 6 months, hey, sounds great, keep up the good work, which is just, why even bother sending a response at that point? Because you're not doing anything to help other than saying, yeah, I responded, so now I can check that off my list. And to go back to WAER at Syracuse, it was a culture of helping each other get better. And I don't think that, there's a saying out there that I might butcher it, but, if a candle helps light another candle, it doesn't lose its flame. In that, if I share advice or a piece of, helpful wisdom with somebody, that doesn't make me any less of a broadcaster. It doesn't take away from the job that I'm doing. And I think we're all better off for that, because I know that when I was at the age of 18 to 22 in college, all I wanted was to be able to talk to people who I thought were amazing at the job and say, all right, well, how did you, in the same conversation we're having now, how did you get to where you are? And what did you do to get yourself better? Because, like, I, on the side, I love to play tennis. I'm not very good, but I like to watch videos of the pros who do stuff. And I'm like, wow, I can't fathom doing that. Maybe one day I'll get to 20% of that, but in what I do professionally, I'd like to think that the people who are at the top, that, one day, hopefully I can be that good too. And so to understand how they did that, and I think it's my responsibility now as someone who has been a recipient of that advice and who is still very much growing and getting better, to be able to share that with younger people, because if I'm in a position to help people, of course I should.
So now, working past, you mentioned your professional career now. Right after college, you worked with a lot of baseball teams, the Syracuse Chiefs, the Dayton Dragons, Fort Wayne Tin Caps. Did you have a favorite baseball location that you worked at right after college? Like, what made that so great? Because the world of baseball, you see the highest of the highs, the lowest of the lows. Where was your favorite spot?
Well, I have to go back even before that, because growing up, my family would take trips to Cape Cod. And so I knew that the Cape Cod Baseball League was a preeminent summer college baseball league. And so it wasn't even after my freshman year, it was about midway through my freshman year, I knew that people from Syracuse would go to the Alaska Baseball League. A couple of my buddies went out there, or to the Cape. And so I applied to all 10 teams in the Cape League, and I only heard back from one. And the one that I did hear back from, the gentleman who was the coordinator of broadcasters, and everybody there is a volunteer. So he had recently retired from a career in Wall Street and lived on the Cape. And so Pat Loftus, he got my email the day after he had reached out to a gentleman by the name of Dan Duva. Dan is the radio play-by-play announcer for the Vegas Golden Knights in the NHL. but he is kind of the pioneer of Cape League broadcasting, starting it with a team in Chatham, Massachusetts, maybe in the early to mid 2000s. Dan started his career at Syracuse, finished out at Fordham, but Pat, who hired me, reached out to Dan and said, "Hey, do you have anybody from Syracuse who you might be able to recommend for this internship?" Well, it just so happened that I, with no baseball experience whatsoever, because Syracuse does not have a baseball team, I emailed the next day. Pat thought that I was recommended by Dan. I was very much not recommended by Dan, but that's a big part of what helped me get the internship. And so I did that in the summer of 2008 and 2009. And then in the summer of 2010, between my junior and senior years, was when I worked for the Chiefs. So I went from summer ball, college level, to AAA, which is guys who are fighting for a roster spot or kind of washing their way out of professional baseball. And that was an atmosphere that was inherently overwhelming the entire year. I just didn't really, I felt like I was walking on eggshells the whole time because I was finding my way as a broadcaster. I was still very raw. And I was a 20-year-old walking into a AAA clubhouse with guys looking at me like, who the heck is this guy? And why is he asking me questions? And then the next year I went to Dayton. I think I have to say that's my favorite spot because that's where I met my wife. So I would get a demerit if I didn't answer that. But I spent almost 3 seasons after that in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And that's really my most fond memories of. It was where I got my first TV experience because they broadcast all their home games on TV. And to that point, I had almost no TV experience. It's kind of funny that I've ended up doing predominantly television when all I ever did at the beginning was radio. And I'm still friends with the people in that front office there. They were so great to me because I would miss time both in the off season and during the season to go broadcast events for ESPN, whether it was high school basketball. One year, I want to say it was 2013, I went for a few days to go do the Ultimate Frisbee College Championships in Madison, Wisconsin. And I can't thank enough, the people who I worked for there who encouraged me to go do these things because they understood that at age 23 or 24 at the time, my life's goal was not to broadcast Midwest League baseball, that there was a bigger opportunity for me there. And they very easily could have said, no, you're our full-time employee. We hired you to call the games. You're going to call the games and you're not going to go do this other stuff. And I think that my career path turns out differently, if not for their benevolence and understanding of the opportunity that was there for me. So every part has a favorite moment or two to it, but it was in Fort Wayne where the growth opportunity really presented itself, both with the ability to put together a television tape and then get bigger opportunities as well.
And those bigger opportunities with ESPN, I know for a lot of people growing up, ESPN is kind of seen as the Mecca. It's the top of the mountain for broadcasting. So when you finally did get to work with ESPN for the first time, what did that feel like? Just kind of stepping into what feels like almost the biggest role ever. And obviously there's certainly levels to ESPN. But at the end of the day, it is ESPN. So what did that feel like for you?
The same as it does now, still in disbelief that that's my job. It was definitely intimidating because I did not know the full mechanics of how a TV broadcast worked. When do you start talking in an open? When do you lay out? I had very little television basketball experience. So coming from radio, where you have to describe everything, to go into TV, where you're having a conversation with the analyst while you're calling the game together and you're trying to draw out his or her expertise, is a totally different experience. So my focus was, let me get the calls right. Let me make sure I have names and numbers correct, and I'll let the rest flow from there. So it was really just an adherence to my fundamentals at first, because I knew that was well within my control, and then I would grow from there.
Definitely. I think kind of starting off and making that transition certainly has to be difficult. And kind of talking about difficult things, what's the most difficult sport for you to broadcast? It sounds like you've done almost every sport out there. So what's really a challenge for you to capture and provide a show to the audience for?
The one where I'm still learning the most is wrestling, because I took that over in 2017 when Adam Amin moved off of it, and he had been on it for a number of years. And it's just a very different sport. A lot of us grow up watching football, basketball, baseball, maybe playing those things, but not everybody wrestles. Not everybody watches wrestling because it's not as widely televised. And we don't do as many events during the regular season as we do basketball, or let's say any other winter sport. So just learning the intricacies of, it's the same as when you go to a new grocery store. Where is the produce and where's the pasta and where do they keep the milk? So figuring out where all those things are, for me, it was an understanding of what's the history of the sport, who are the people that I need to know, who are the coaches that I need to know, and getting a full grasp on it. In the same way that when I started doing college football in 2014, I grew up just outside of New York City, where you almost never hear anyone talk about college sports. There are 8 or so pro teams in the New York City area between New York and New Jersey. And so it's all pro sports all the time. So I didn't follow college sports growing up. I went to Syracuse during the worst run of football ever with Greg Robinson as the head coach. It was just pitiful. I went to the first game my freshman year. They were getting blown out by Jake Locker in Washington, and I left at halftime. And I don't think I went to another game as a fan the rest of my time there. I was more interested in being part of the studio broadcaster. And ironically, then I never actually broadcast a Syracuse football game at the Dome until this past year when I got to go there for when they played Rutgers. So I never did it as a student because the minor league baseball season after my junior year bled over into the football season. And so I was just so far behind in terms of getting air ready. And so I never ended up doing a game at the Dome. I did a couple on the road. But yeah, so learning college football and the history of the sport and the rivalries, that has been a learning curve too, going back now 8 years, of just getting an understanding of the passion of these fan bases and why does this team hate that team and what is this coach most remembered for. So it's always something new to learn, but I love that because I'm an inherently curious person, sometimes to a fault, where I just like to ask. I'm like a toddler sometimes where I just ask why. And sometimes those might come off as stupid questions, but that's the only way you're going to learn things, is just by asking questions.
And so moving along your broadcasting career a little bit more now, working into the pandemic, what was that like for you, having to call games remotely, having to deal with calling games where there were no fans? What was that like compared to your typical broadcast?
Well, I was definitely nervous at first because I wanted to make sure that my internet worked, because if your internet's not strong enough, you're not going to get a good connection. So, I mean, that's totally out of my control, not worth worrying about, but I worry about a lot of things. So that was definitely one of them. Then getting past that, it was getting eye discipline, which sounds like quarterback speak, but when you're doing a game from home, you have a big monitor that's showing you the game feed, the broadcast that you're watching at home on TV. But then you also have somebody that's called a spotter who is showing you, hey, this is the person who caught the ball. This is the person who made the tackle. Normally they'd be standing next to you in the booth, but that was coming through on a separate screen. So trying to watch the game feed, you have a stat feed up in front of you as well. And so understanding what you need to prioritize in those moments, when to look where. And you have now just a 2-dimensional view of what's happening on the field versus 3D if you're there. So just sitting back to make sure that you're not going to get ahead of a call, or that you're not going to say, what you might anticipate is going to happen, and just really describing what you're seeing, and making sure also, because when I'm talking to my analyst standing next to me, I can see when that person's going to talk. At home, there's a little bit of a delay. So really giving space for the analyst after a play to get in, whereas normally you could have a quick back and forth if you're standing next to each other, but it's not as easy when you're doing it from home.
Definitely. I've done a few remote broadcasts myself, and I can certainly say it's almost always more difficult. And kind of continuing that conversation about difficulties moving up within ESPN, how was that like? Because you talk a lot about WAER in college, how you had kind of this group of people that really all wanted to make each other better. It wasn't overly competitive. But ESPN, you've got the best broadcasters in the world, and you've added football, you've added softball, you keep working your way up. How has that been? How has the challenge been? And how have your coworkers been kind of dealing with them and trying to help each other? But now you're competing for a job against people too.
I just keep showing up and trying to do the best job that I can in whatever sport that I can. One of the things that we all have to accept getting into broadcasting is that it is an inherently subjective field, is that 99% of the population could say that you or I or somebody else is the greatest broadcaster they've ever heard. But the opinions that matter are the people who make the decisions at whatever company you work for. But if you're a lawyer and you win trials at 100% rate, you are objectively the best lawyer out there. But in broadcasting, we understand that, everybody's style is different, and there's no objective way to look at it. So I don't view necessarily my coworkers, other play-by-play announcers, as competition, because I have not met a bad person at ESPN. Everybody has been incredibly friendly to me, especially now that there when I came in, there were not younger announcers than me. Now there are younger announcers than me who some of them knew while they were in college, which is really cool to see their growth. But the older guys too, who I've looked up to for a long time, Dan Shulman, Bob Wischusen, to name a couple, have just been so welcoming and so nice. And we all watch each other's work. We all admire each other's work. And there's an understanding for me that at age 32 right now, that some of my colleagues have been at it for almost as long as I've been alive, if not longer. When I started, Brent Musburger was with ESPN, and Sean McDonough he called the World Series, when I was in diapers for CBS. So of course, we'd all love to move up and we all love to be doing the biggest games, but I understand that there are people in front of me who are going to be broadcasting Hall of Famers if they're not already. So my goal is to do the best storytelling job, the best descriptions that I can for the game that I'm calling, and I can only control that. And so, we'd all love to do every championship in every sport, but I'm really happy to be where I am because I think it's the best company I do 6 or 7 sports, and I love that aspect of it, that I get to do such a variety of things. It keeps it fun all the time.
And one sport that you've been doing so much of lately is college softball. And college softball, I feel like it's been getting so much more popular this year. You had that Oklahoma team, which it almost felt unfair to watch them compete against the other squads. But college softball is getting a lot more attention on ESPN. They even had a few games on ABC, I think, this year. And women's sports have been getting more popular, and they've been kind of placed in the limelight. And once they're there, people start watching. So in your opinion, how has it been to watch the growth of women's sports, and how do you think, what's the best strategy for women's sports to continue to grow in popularity over the future?
Well, to answer the second part, I think that the programming department at ESPN has done a phenomenal job in helping advance the growth of the sport. This year, I think we had more than, I hope I'm not getting this number wrong, like 600 games on TV for college softball. And only a couple of years ago, it was maybe half that number. So having the conference networks is huge, SEC network, ACC network, in addition to ESPN 1, 2, and ESPNU. There's so many avenues for people to get college softball. The way I got started was I was on a basketball road trip. I was doing 3 games over the span of 6 or 7 days back in 2019. I'm in South Bend, and I get a call from Meg Aronowitz, who oversees college softball. And she goes, I have an emergency. Beth Mowens can't do this game at Florida. Can you fill in? I was like, well, I need to be upfront with you. I have never called a college softball game before, but I'm happy to do my best at it. And having done plenty of baseball in the past, I felt like I would be able to pick up on it pretty well. And talk about intimidating. So the booth that I was in was Michelle Smith, 2-time Olympic gold medalist, Amanda Scarborough, 2-time All-American pitcher at Texas A&M, and me, who had never called a game before. Wow. And they could not have been more welcoming, which is true of everybody in the college softball world, because the analysts who I'm working with are national champions. They're all Americans. And then there's me who, couldn't hit a single fast pitch if my life depended on it. And that's one of the things that I have loved personally about the softball world, is that in sports like football and men's basketball, the media coverage is so saturated that it's almost to the point where the coaches and players are like, okay, we've had enough of talking about whatever, like, let's just play the game. And softball is still a growing sport. And there will be coaches who say, thank you for coming to cover us. And I'm like, no, thank you. Like, this is an amazing sport. I love doing this. And so I think there is a reciprocal gratitude from the players and coaches and us as the broadcasters. We're happy to be there. They're happy to be on TV. And the sport is so fun. It moves fast. The stories are great. The people are great. I really love it. And I think it has what baseball could use too, is a run rule. Like, I did a baseball regional a couple of weeks ago. One of the games was 20-1, and then the winning team had to turn around and play the next day. So, like, it's not good for the team and their bullpen arms. It's not good for the viewers, because if you see a 20-1 game, you're not going to stick around and watch that. And so I think it's fast paced. It's great. I love it. I love everybody that I work with there. And I did a lot of softball games this year, and it's always super fun. The postseason atmosphere was great. Got to go to Florida State. They got eliminated surprisingly early as the number 2 national seed. And then to Arizona State. Northwestern beat them on the road in 3 games. And Unfortunately, their draw was Oklahoma in the first round of the Women's College World Series. But I tell you what, for a sport that I didn't do until a couple of years ago, it's easily become one of my favorites.
So softball, one of your favorites now. You've been doing a lot of basketball, doing a lot of football. We see where you are now, about 10 years into your career. Where do you see yourself in another 10 years? Do you see yourself doing some similar things? Are there other sports you want to work your way into? What's the Mike Couzens career in like 2032, let's say?
The safest thing I think you can do in broadcasting is never to try and project anything into the future. It's safe to have aspirational things, but you can't say, hey, in 5 years I want to be here, because you just never know the way things are going to go. For instance, I was freelancing in 2012 and 2013, and then I got offered to come aboard full time in 2014. And I think, if you look at the moves at that time, Joe Davis went to go work for Fox, Carter Blackburn went to go work for CBS, and I'm a guy who's in the right place at the right time, who had become familiar to the company. So, there's a large element of luck. The way that things go is being in the right place at the right time and just doing the best work that you can. So I'd love to continue to advance within the sports that I'm doing, whether it's college football or college basketball. I've been fortunate enough to do ACC games for the last several years, which I love. It's my alma mater is in that league, and I think the competition is phenomenal. I love to keep doing more college softball, college baseball, and I've gotten the chance over the last several years and a couple of games this year to fill in for John Shambi on Sunday Night Baseball on ESPN Radio. And when I was in the minors, you play a day game on Sunday. That's the thing I would do just to wind down at the end of the week, because I didn't own a TV. There was no sense in me having a cable subscription because I was never home. And I would just listen to the game on the radio. And I would always be fascinated. I was like, this is the coolest thing. They have sponsors for things that they do. The starting lineups are sponsored. Whereas on my broadcast, I'm just like, hey, if my mom's listening, I'm really happy about it. And so when I hear that music play, I still get chills, because it was not that long ago that I was dreaming of doing that. And now I'm living that. And it's amazingly cool.
Yeah, and that's one big thing. You don't want to make too many predictions for the future. Obviously, with all the growth you've had over the last 10 years, I wouldn't be surprised if you kept moving on up. But we don't want to make too many predictions about broadcasting. My last question for you, I do want to make one last question, and it is about predictions, but it's a little bit different. You're going to be doing college football in the fall, so I'm not going to ask for you to predict about broadcasting, but do you have a bold prediction for the college football playoff season, or maybe the winner of the national championship next year?
Alabama until future notice, I guess, right? The thing that I would love to see, and I think we're headed there, just a matter of time, is expansion. And like I said, with the number of talented broadcasters who are on the roster, the games that I'm calling in college football are a lot. This past year in the Sun Belt and the American Conference, I feel for those teams, because they don't have a realistic opportunity to win the college football playoff unless you are, you have to be UCF or Cincinnati. Not only do you have to have a perfect season, but with the insane way that college football scheduling works, you have to be able to say, all right, well, in this year, we better hope that our non-conference schedule isn't some FCS teams, but we really better hope that it's some really good teams who also have good seasons. And why do we love March Madness so much? It's because UMBC can knock off Virginia, but it's also because UMBC has the chance to knock off Virginia. We can't say that, oh, this team would never beat the other team if we don't ever give them the chance to do it. You can't disprove it by saying it'll never happen. And so I welcome expansion, whether it's 8, 12, 16, whatever the case might be, because I think it's better for a fair playing field, and that it gives everybody more incentive to be interested in the entirety of the regular season versus saying, well, it's predetermined that Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, and maybe Notre Dame are going to be in the college football playoff. And then it's not as exciting for everybody.
I would really wish that we got an expansion. I think that would be more entertaining to broadcast, definitely more entertaining to watch. So hopefully that will end up happening. That's all the questions I've got for you today, but thank you so much for joining the show. I really appreciated talking to you and having you on.
Tyler, it's my pleasure. You asked very good questions. You clearly did your homework, which I really appreciate. So I know you've got it all handled over there. Thanks so much.
So another big thank you to Mike Couzens for coming on to the show. I had an absolute blast talking to him, and he shared so much insight into the world of sports and sports broadcasting. Just an absolute great episode. And we have more great episodes plan for the future. So to make sure you don't miss any of those, you're going to want to follow us on all of our social media pages. You can subscribe to our YouTube down below, or you can follow us on all of our social media platforms. We're on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram, and all of those links can be found right below in the description. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the 20 Questions Podcast with Tyler Rakin.